Dr. Joe Abba, former Director General of Nigeria's Bureau of Public Sector Reforms, tweeted a question on Nigeria's repeated grid collapses. Take a look at that tweet here. Who can explain the collapse of the electricity national grid to me, please? And then he tags our next guest, Mr. Eyo Ekpo. Says it's like the system having a heart attack. Given how often it happens, is the system about to die? What causes the collapse and who's responsible? How can it be avoided? It's part of his hashtag Niger Knowledge X series. Let's take a look at Mr. Ekpo's tweets. Says, I attempted Dr. Joaba's recent 5 questions around systems collapse in his hashtag Niger Knowledge X conversations. When I was done, look at that, I had a 3,000 word paper, too long. It's now down to 2,200 pages. And if you find it boring, don't be upset. Just blame Dr. Abba. And then he goes into a very extensive thread. So we have him with us, joining us now from our Abuja studio to discuss further. Mr. Eyo Ekpo himself. He's the CEO of Excredite Consulting. He's also a former commissioner of markets, competition, and rates at the Nigerian Electricity Regulatory Commission, NERC, and former Attorney General of Cross River State. Good morning to you, sir. Thank you so much for joining us. So when we say system collapse of the grid, can you help us out? What does that mean?
Okay. Good morning, Rotus, and good morning to all your viewers out there. Thank you for having me. So I hope that the fellows and members of the Nigerian Society of Engineers are not going to take me to task at the end of this. But I'm a lawyer moonlighting, it seems, as an engineer, but no. How a grid operates is something that concerns all of us. So a systems collapse is what happens when, to put it very simply, the electricity grid is no longer in balance. An electricity grid is really a transport pipeline, so to speak. I'm trying to keep this as simple as I can. And thankfully, I'm a lawyer, so hopefully it will be a little easier to do. But a grid is simply a pipeline that conveys electrons from generators to distributors. As you can imagine, with all pipelines, any pipeline you can think of, it has to be kept in balance. And in this case, the balance we're talking about here is an engineering balance between the voltage at which these electrons travel and their frequency on one hand. But, you know, I would add another kind of balance, which is commercial or financial balance. For every electron that goes out into the market, some money equivalent to the value of that electron needs to go back in so that that pipeline continues to run and continues to grow as population demands require it to grow. If either of these two balances is upset, the system will inevitably collapse.
Thank you so much.
It's as simple as that.
And can you dig further into the root causes of these collapses?
In Nigeria, first of all, let's understand this. A systems collapse is a major aberration. It should never happen. Your typical engineer of any persuasion, mechanical, electrical, whatever kind, will tell you that engineering is actually a very simple science. You follow the rules, it's science. So if you follow the rules, you will be okay. If you don't follow the rules, things go bad. So it's not about the engineering, really. It's essentially about the human element, the X factor, as I define it, which comes into play when an engineering system of any kind has to be made to operate for human beings. So really, at the end of the day, it's not the engineering that is the problem. So let's not blame our systems operators. Let's not blame those who we give the very difficult and almost impossible task of maintaining a national grid for us. Let us instead blame ourselves, whether we are consumers, whether we are generators, whether we are distribution entities, whether we are policymakers, whether we are government, state, federal. It's really the human factor that, when brought into play, and when we, as we are wont to do as willful human beings, when we try to disobey the laws of economics and disobey the laws of engineering, which follows the disobedience to the laws of economics, we get into this trouble that we call systems collapses. It doesn't happen elsewhere. I said in one of those tweets that I met a gentleman at a company called PJM. PJM Interconnect runs system operations for 13 states in the northeast of the United States. And I met a guy there in 2014 who had been there for over 40 years. He had never seen a systems collapse. He had seen brownouts, occasional collapses in a small part of the grid, which is easily managed, but never a total collapse like we seem to have with such depressing regularity here in Nigeria.
Speaking of the depressing regularity, sir, is the system about to die? Is it on life support as far as the grid is concerned?
No, it's not. It won't die. Look, that was a bit of a hyperbole. I was a little bit exaggerating when I said systems collapse is like a heart attack, but it is a major event, which is an aberration. Our system will not die. We're putting money into it, maybe not enough. In fact, definitely not enough. If you ask me, I would say that the backlog of investments, which we ought to have made consistently over time and have not made up till date, probably adds up to hundreds of billions of dollars, which we have to spend just to be able to get a system in place, an electricity system in place for us that suits our population of 200 million today. And I'm not talking about investments going forward. I'm talking about backlog. Hundreds of millions of dollars in fuel supply, in generation, in transmission, and in distribution that we have not made. And the thing about engineering is that you cannot overlook an investment that you must make in a utility system. You must make that investment one way or another, or the loss is yours. So yeah, our system is not going to die. It's limping along. It could be a lot better than it is, and because it's not, we suffer untold financial, socioeconomic, commercial consequences that we can't even begin to fathom at this point.
Thank you so much for that, sir. The grid structure, I want you to speak about that. Can we maintain a one-size-fits-all transmission grid?
If you ask me, let me own up to something. I wasn't just an attorney general or a member of the commission in NERC. I was also, I had the privilege, the really great privilege of being team leader for power sector reform in the BPE about 20 years ago. And the law that we have today, the policy that we have today was actually put together by my team, this team had this law that we have first passed in 2003. Before it had to go back to the National Assembly again when the president at the time, President OBJ, didn't assent to it for reasons best known to him. And then he went back to the National Assembly and became law in 2005. So the system that we have today is one which at the time, I think, was fit for purpose. We're talking here about 2001, 2002, 2003, 2005, when the Power Sector Reform Act came into effect. There has been, if I may use that phrase, a bargain between states and the federal government. And this bargain flows from our history of a unitary system of government, albeit we call ourselves a federation. And at that time, the bargain was, look, the federal government will lead just about everything. So the easiest thing to do at the time was to take the structure that we had, which was a national market, one single national market, divided into generation sector, transmission sector, distribution sector, which was itself further subdivided into a number of zones. And that structure wasn't changed. We just took the 10 or 11 zones that we had in the distribution sector and turned them into private companies that covered a number of states, except for Lagos, which has 2 discos. We took transmission, which was one single national entity, one single grid, and made it into TCN. And we took the 6, 7, 8 generation plants that we had and made them into single asset generation companies. That's the structure that we had. If things had gone well, and that's a very big if, which requires a whole seminar on its own, but if things had gone well, we would probably have evolved to a situation where you have a national market, but with our distribution companies having lots of franchises, lots of subsidiaries that cover individual states. It hasn't happened. And so today, I don't think, speaking quite honestly, that the reform plan that we started out with in 2001 is still as it is today, given the change in science, technology, engineering achievements and advances that we have made, given the change in our demographics, given the change in even the way we are as a people. I don't think that one-size-fits-all national grid system would still work for us. I think that what we need to begin to look at is to bring more states actively into the fray, decentralize our distribution, pay some more heed to the actual wording of our constitution, which actually empowers states to make laws for the distribution sector, for regulation and for transmission, if it is carried on within those states, not outside the borders, which is still federal responsibility, but within those states. We need to bring more states that are willing and able to do so into the frame of activity in terms of regulation and operation of our electricity distribution markets.
Thank you so much for that. So you talked about a lot of change, demographics and structure and so on. When we speak about change and where we need to go, who do we hold responsible here? Earlier you were saying, us end users, so on and so forth, but who do we hold responsible?
Responsible for what?
As far as the change we need to see in the structure of following the constitution, empowering the states, the transmission company of Nigeria, so on and so forth. Is it leadership, or how do you see it?
So at the beginning, we talked about what causes a system collapse, and I said to you, it's not engineering; it's the human factor. I think that the federal government, on one hand, states, not states as a group, but individual states that are willing and able and desire it, need to begin to look at how we can transit responsibility for local markets, for the distribution sector, to those states that want to do so. It's a very delicate process. It's never been done before. But when you have the kind of situation in which we are, in which one single grid actually holds back lots of states, and you can mention any number of states that you want to, Edo State, Rivers State, Kaduna State, Kebbi State, Plateau State, Lagos State, Ogun State, Oyo State. These are states which, in my respectful view, need to bite the bullet and develop the capacity to be able to engage with the federal government about transiting responsibility for the electricity business that goes on within those states to entities set up by those states under a clear-cut policy and legal framework that those states ought to be able to begin to establish now. But if you have a state that doesn't have such a framework for engagement at local level, of course the federal government will continue to do what it does for all the states put together.
Thank you so much. I only got less than a couple of minutes. I want to quickly get your take.
If you ask me who's responsible,
yes,
simple answer I would give to you is states, players, generating companies, distribution companies, and the federal government, and of course, NERC, the regulatory entity, which really ought to be dealing with cross-border trade and not local issues. Those stakeholders need to begin to come around the table in a different kind of conversation. We really need to think about a major change in our policy at this point in time.
Fantastic. About a minute to go, sir. I want to get your quick take on bundling TC, Transmission Company of Nigeria. The government was, looking at reviewing that. How quickly does that need to happen?
It should have happened last year, 5 years ago, 6 years ago. Right. TCN, even by the law that we have today, the Power Sector Reform Act, ought to be now two separate companies. One dealing with the hardware, maintenance, operation, and construction, the transmission side, and the other dealing with the soft side, which is system operations. The law that we have today actually requires that. Why it hasn't happened is still a mystery. But really, we're even going beyond having two separate companies out of TCN. TCN itself, and we talked about the systems collapse. So when a systems collapse happens, the grid, the national grid, is recovered by what operators in TCN call islanding. So you already have TCN operating today as, I think the number is 8 or 9 different regions across the country. The country is broken up into 8 or 9 semi-autonomous regions. And when the grid is recovering, it is brought back through these islands. So they start gradually. All right. So already you have in place a system whereby we can operate as different power pools, which is what happens in every large federal jurisdiction like Nigeria, Brazil, Chile, India, the United States. They all operate as different pools. And I think that's where we need to be going.
Thank you so much, sir. Mr. Eyo Ekpo, who is the CEO of Excredite Consulting Ltd. And also former Commissioner Markets, Competition and Rates at the Nigerian Electricity Regulatory Commission. Great insight on the power sector.